Knowing how and when to do partial Roth conversions can save you hundreds of thousands in legally avoidable taxes. A while back, a man we'll call Dave got on my calendar. He was 73 and was finally ready to hire a certified financial planning professional to help him minimize his taxes. He bragged about how he'd been able to pay almost nothing in taxes over this last decade. But now, all of a sudden, as his required minimum distributions, RMDs, have been kicking in, he is getting killed in taxes each year. Honestly, as a wealth advisor, calls like this are painful. He wants to know if there is anything he can do. He feels desperate now. There are a few things, but nothing compares to what could have been done had he started long-term tax planning at least a decade sooner. I'll walk you through it so you don't end up like Desperate Dave here. Welcome back to the savviest financial minds on YouTube. And over my 15 years helping people navigate everything financial planning, I've had a dozen or so of those Desperate Dave calls. And those are just the ones that are comfortable finally reaching out for help. I bet most Daves just grin and bear it. They're tough, they can handle it, they don't want any help. Sorry if your name's Dave, by the way, but you get the idea. Just because Benjamin Franklin warns of inevitable taxation, that doesn't mean you have to volunteer to pay the maximum amount possible. There is a better way. You wouldn't even have to have a wealth advisor helping you, although, of course, the more you have at stake here, the more I'd recommend it. But I'm biased. It is within your reach to at least do some of this on your own. To best understand what you need to do here and how much of an impact it can have, it helps to think of tax brackets as tax buckets instead. You start with the bucket that represents the lowest tax amount and fill that one up before moving on to the next lowest bucket. Some buckets are much smaller than others. The 10% bucket, for example, is tiny, whereas the 24% bucket is relatively large. The 35% bucket is also quite large, and the 37% bucket, well, it's more like a pool, as it's a catch-all for any and all income that reaches over a certain level. Now, the exact dollar amounts in each bracket change every year, but here's what they look like in 2024 so that you can have a rough idea of where you stand. Also, the rates can change over time as well. For example, the current tax rates are set to move back up in 2025 unless Congress takes action before then. Regardless of the specifics, the concept of filling up your buckets will hold true no matter when you're considering Roth conversions. The challenge for tax buckets is that these lower tax buckets each year are use it or lose it. I mean, all the buckets are, but these lower ones are the ones you might regret not using if you could have. You can't not fill it up one year and then decide the next year when you're realizing more income that, oh, actually, I'd like some of this to go back and fill up that 10% tax bucket from last year. If you don't mind, please, Mr. IRS, sir. Yeah, it obviously doesn't work like that. If you don't use all of your 10% or 12% bucket this year, it's gone as of December 31st. This is important because while most high earners and good savers focus on what happens on the high end of their income, defer, avoid as much as possible. Nobody wants to pay taxes at these levels. When the brackets are low, those are actually opportunities to harvest income, to accelerate it, to fill these lower tax buckets while you can. It's these opportunities that Desperate Dave missed. He could have been chipping away at his massive 100% taxable traditional IRA over here in his 60s, strategically filling up these lower tax buckets. We could have systematically chipped away tens of thousands of dollars each year, which maybe doesn't sound like a lot to you, but for some, those systematic partial Roth conversions result in hundreds of thousands, sometimes more than $1 million in tax savings over their lifetime. I'll show you an in-depth, real $800,000 case study here in a bit. But first, let me show you just a couple of simpler examples of what this looks like. Let's take recently retired Rick and Rita. We're planning at the beginning of the year, and it looks like they should receive roughly $50,000 worth of income throughout their first complete calendar year of retirement. There are a few year-end distributions that are giving them some uncertainty about what the exact amount will be. But they think it'll be pretty close to that $50,000 figure. They're also expecting roughly $15,000 worth of deductions. Now with those numbers, they'd like to be able to fill up the 12% bucket bracket. which in 2024 is $94,300. So let's use that for this example. So they decide to do the Roth conversion barbelling strategy, which I first introduced in this video. Rick and Rita ultimately do a $30,000 Roth conversion in the early months of the year. We get to the end of the year and it turns out that their income wasn't $50,000. It ended up being closer to $59,000, and their deductions were closer to $18,000 instead of the $15,000 they were expecting. So now let's add their $30,000 Roth conversion that they already made for the year on top of that. That means that as it stands at this point, they are going to end the year with a taxable income of $71,000. Well, the difference between this number we're left with here and the upper bound of that 12% bucket, remember $94,300 in our example, tells us the amount they can convert at the end of the year and still be at that very low 12% tax rate. $94,300 minus $71,000 equals $23,300. So now, before December 31st, Rick and Rita do another partial Roth conversion for that $23,300. This is the other side of their Roth conversion barbell for the year. Now, of course, when we add that to their taxable income figure from before, they're able to slide in at exactly, or at least really close to, the upper bound of the 12% tax rate bucket. They're not risking that flowing too much over for the year into the 22% bucket, which is a big jump. And they're making sure to not miss out on this sweet tax deal. You see how this can work? If you could do this systematically over time, the impact is immense. Consider this time wise Wendy. She's a 60-year-old widow. She receives $20,000 per year from Social Security and $40,000 per year as a survivorship benefit from her deceased spouse's pension. She has $200,000 in a brokerage account and $700,000 in a traditional IRA. Given basic growth assumptions, if she does no long-term tax planning, like our poor desperate Dave from the beginning, she'll face $50,000 or more per year in required minimum distributions starting in a decade as she heads into her 70s. So Wendy starts to do $40,000 a year in partial Roth conversions each year. She does that for 10 years. With her deductions, she can do that while staying in the low 12% tax bracket. If she does this systematically for those 10 years, she'll be able to get $400,000 converted into her Roth IRA. With all those conversions only being taxed at 12%, that means that she'll have paid $48,000 total in taxes on those $400,000 on that money. Now she just lets it all ride. The Roth grows. Her RMDs on the amount that is left in her traditional IRA kick in after a few years. She just uses that to supplement her retirement spending. If you project out what wise Wendy's financial picture will then look like over time, this is how her wealth would grow depending upon how long she ends up living. These dark blue bars represent the value of her traditional IRA. It never really grows that much. Early on, she's effectively converting all the growth, and then later on, the balance eventually gets eaten into due to the RMDs. While the green here shows the projected value of her Roth, not subject to RMDs and free from any further taxation. In this simplistic case, for the sake of example, you can note here that when Wendy turns 100, her Roth could easily be worth around $6 million, totally tax-free. And she was able to accomplish this at a cost of just $48,000 in taxes early in her retirement. There is significant value in partial Roth conversions. If Wendy had done that $400,000 conversion all at once, she would have incurred hundreds of thousands of dollars in taxes, which, compounded over her lifetime, would have cost her much of this value opportunity. By chipping away at these conversions at very low tax rates, we can create this incredibly valuable compounding Roth machine and never get pushed back into the higher tax brackets now or in the future. When I'm working with clients, sometimes we're doing this very tactically, like paying attention to potentially otherwise difficult years when your income might be lower than normal, to take advantage of this a little. Maybe you're out of work for part or all of a year, as many people found themselves in 2020, for example. Or if you own your own business, you might be used to significant fluctuations. You can be intentional, strategic about taking advantage of conversions in those down years. Most people have an income valley after you retire, so you no longer have your income from work, but before your RMDs kick in, especially if you decide to delay your Social Security until later, something we explore in this video. This period during your 60s is for many the best time to strategically plan these systematic partial conversions. Here's another thing to consider. If you have the option to live off of funds from a taxable account during those early retirement years, as in a brokerage account, for example, an account that has already been taxed over the years, instead of pulling from your traditional IRA, which is 100% taxable, if you can do that, you'll be able to potentially significantly reduce your taxable income and thus amplify the amount you're able to convert in a given year while still staying under those lower tax brackets. Now that you understand the importance and some strategies to really maximize your opportunity here, the question many people have for me is, well, which brackets should I fill up to? And that really depends on your situation. That's not just a cop-out. I'll give you some examples here. I have clients all over the spectrum. Different buckets make sense in different scenarios. Honestly, most people, and if you're not working with an advisor on this, but are watching boring retirement videos about it, then you most likely fall into this category. Most people who are doing Roth conversions like this are trying to fill up that 12% tax bracket, like in the examples earlier. That's why I gave those examples. Often, if you're doing that well, you can turn $700,000 of wealth from a traditional IRA into a $300,000 to $400,000 tax-free Roth IRA. And that'll be enough to keep you from ever crossing higher than that 12% threshold at any point in retirement, like the examples I gave earlier. When we're working with millionaires and multimillionaires, though, it's really difficult to keep you in the 12% bracket. The sheer compounding of wealth tends to pull you above that level. So we're often targeting the large 22 and 24% brackets, before it jumps all the way up into the 30s. Luckily, those buckets in the low 20s are relatively large, so there's a lot of opportunity there to get a bunch converted early so it can start growing tax-free for you. But when we're helping ultra-high net worth people, those dealing with $10+ million, anything that's not the top bracket sounds great. So you may be pushing all the way up to the 32 or 35% brackets just to get it converted early at a slightly lower rate and now growing tax-free for you, especially when you have concerns about what the future might hold for your wealthy tax bracket. So yeah, the optimal bracket/bucket to target here is going to vary depending on your unique situation. I hope this helped you place it. Now, I promised earlier I would show you a specific case study where a client plans to use these partial Roth conversions during the early years of his retirement in order to save more than $800,000 in legally avoidable taxes. And you get to dive in and see all the nitty-gritty details right here. Don't be a desperate Dave. I'll see you there.